and shape policy around inequality, and I'll be talking about that through the lens of racial inequality in the United States over the very long run. So this talk, Racial Inequality in the 21st Century, is thinking about this topic in the very distant past, but also the present and the future. And material in this talk is drawn from work with many fantastic collaborators and research assistants. They're mentioned at the bottom of this slide here. And with that, let me begin. All right, so we know that racial disparities in the US today are very large. But why should we care to study racial inequality in the past? So I'm going to make two arguments to kind of justify my existence as an economic historian, saying that we should pay attention to history for the purposes of designing good policies today. And there are two key reasons why I strongly feel that history can inform policy today. The first is that there are certain kinds of economic disparities between Black and white Americans where we really actually need the history to understand the magnitude of those gaps and also their degree of persistence and stubbornness. And I will be discussing this through the lens of the racial wealth gap in the US over the past 160 years. And I'll be making the argument that the gap today truly stems from starting conditions for Black and white Americans under the institution of slavery. The second reason that I feel history should inform policy today is that on many economic indicators, racial progress has stagnated. So you could think about wealth, wages, income, et cetera. We just haven't seen much change in the past several decades. And for ideas about how to reduce the gap going forward, we need to actually turn back the clock and see, when did these gaps actually move, and draw inspiration from a time in the United States, in the history of the United States, where policy was bolder. And I'll be discussing that through the example of federal minimum wage policy in the 1960s. So let's begin with the racial wealth gap. This continues to be the largest economic gap between Black and white Americans. So if you're to take a common statistic, the white to Black average wealth ratio, today that's 6 to 1. That's equivalent to Black Americans holding about 17 cents for every dollar of white wealth. You can compare that to the income ratio, which is substantial, but also substantially smaller. A gap of about 2 to 1, or Black Americans having about 50 cents of income for every white dollar of income. Now, what's striking about the racial wealth gap is it's been remarkably stable for the last 40 years. And you can see that in this figure, this white to Black per capita ratio has been around, between 5 and 6 to 1 for the past 4 decades. So this is where, as an economic historian, I step in. Well, what has this looked like over a much longer time span? So my collaborators and I set about putting together the first, to our knowledge, time series of the racial wealth gap, starting from the pre-emancipation period in the 1860s to the present. And we do this by piecing together sleuthing for data, which is one of my favorite activities, from many, many different sources. For example, we draw on the historical US Census, which in 1860 and 1870 recorded wealth of the population. For the late 19th century and early 20th century, we draw on Southern state tax records. Sorry, I'm just noticing that my pictures have gone away. Picture very detailed reports that in this era in Southern states of Jim Crow record keeping actually recorded wealth of the Black and white population separately. We then turn to the work of Monroe Nathan Work, a preeminent Black sociologist who published annual statistics of Black economic progress and who reported some of the only estimates we could find of aggregate Black wealth in the United States. And then finally, covering the last 70 years, we draw on the Survey of Consumer Finances, a nationally representative survey that asks respondents about their financial status and wealth levels. And this carries us forward to the present. Once we've put together this full time series, 160 years of the Black-White wealth gap, what do we learn? Well, this stagnation in the recent period is nothing new. And the wealth gap overall has a very clear pattern from the pre-Civil War period to the present. It's a hockey stick. Convergence was rapid in the initial 50 years after emancipation, with the gap starting at a level of 60 to 1. That's 2 cents of Black wealth for every dollar of white wealth, converging to a level of 20 to 1 by 1870, to a level of about 10 to 1 by 1920. But if you look at the past 100 years, we haven't seen that much movement in the racial wealth gap. So what can explain this very persistent pattern and this very striking period of convergence in a time period where we might think, well, historical discrimination is at an all-time high during Southern redemption right after the Civil War? We're going to understand this evolution of the racial wealth gap with a very simple model. We write down a process for wealth accumulation that will apply to each group in the population, white Americans and Black Americans, and think about this starting from the historical period through the present. We model wealth tomorrow as a function of wealth today, so those are the W's, with these time indices. Wealth today plus savings from income Y, which together appreciate at a capital gains rate Q. Income has its own growth process determined by this growth rate G. The growth rate of the racial wealth gap, again measured as the ratio of white to Black wealth, is going to be determined by 2 key forces: differences in wealth appreciation rates, or these capital gains rates for each group, and differences in savings, of which the savings rate and existing levels of income and wealth are a component. So taking this very simple model, we're going to embark on a thought experiment. Suppose starting just after emancipation, we imagine that Black and white Americans have what we call equal conditions for wealth accumulation, meaning in our model that wealth appreciation rates are identical across the 2 groups as are savings rates. We're going to plug in the observed income growth rates for the 2 groups that we see in our data, and we're going to start things off in 1870 with the initial wealth and income gaps. That's a gap of 20 to 1 and a gap of 4 to 1 approximately, respectively. Let's see what happens. Voila, a hockey stick shape of wealth convergence. So in the first few decades after emancipation, what we see is rapid convergence, followed by that familiar slowdown in racial wealth convergence. And recall, this is under the scenario where we have equal conditions for wealth accumulation for Black and white Americans. We can use this model to think through a few different scenarios and to compare the observed convergence to what would come out of this model and this ideal benchmark of equal conditions for the 2 groups. What we see is that in blue here, the observed data, wealth convergence has in fact been much slower. That's consistent with, of course, Black and white Americans not facing equal conditions of wealth accumulation over the past 150 years. So the gap today is more like 6 to 1. In the black here, these numbers on the side, you can see what our model would predict. If Black and white Americans had equal conditions for wealth accumulation, today the racial wealth gap would still be 3 to 1, white Americans holding triple the amount of wealth of Black Americans. Furthermore, in the year 2230, over 200 years from now, you'll see that the racial wealth gap hasn't converged, even under this ideal scenario. The gap remains about 40%. White American wealth, 40% higher than Black American wealth. So this is quite striking. We have, even in an ideal benchmark, convergence basically never happening. And we know that in reality, the two groups have not faced equal conditions. There's been discrimination in financial markets, housing markets, and an inability through expropriation, through racial violence, for Black Americans to accumulate the same amount of wealth over generations as white Americans. Given that the two groups in reality face different conditions for wealth accumulation, what can we say about the future of the wealth gap? In the dark line, we use our estimates of observed differences in wealth appreciation rates and savings, and we compare that to, again, our sort of ideal scenario in the lighter gray line here, where wealth accumulation conditions are equalized. What we see is that in the dark line above, we're not really any longer headed towards convergence. We're headed towards some kind of steady state, a wealth gap of about 5-to-1 or 4-to-1. Under this ideal benchmark, we get continued convergence. It still takes a really long time. Now, most policies that seek to close the racial wealth gap focus on things like savings rates differences between Black and white Americans, or discrimination in the labor market, income differences, or trying to encourage, financial literacy, investing in the right kinds of, stock equity, portfolio diversification. These all boil down to tinkering with the Q and S and the differences in those parameters between the two groups. We run a few numbers to ask the question, what would we really require along those parameters to get convergence in, say, 30 years? Does that seem like a decent enough time to try to have some equality on this measure? It would take income growth rates for Black Americans of 10%, a savings rate of 30%, or a capital gains rate of 5%. Now, you can compare that to the numbers for white Americans, respectively 1.3%, 5%, or 2%. In other words, we're just not really going to get there very quickly focusing on these parameters. We then consider policies that try to explicitly take into account the origins of the wealth gap. For example, we examine the policy for reparations put forward by Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen in their new book, From Here to Equality, a flat payment of about $267,000 for each eligible Black American descendant of the enslaved. Now, obviously, a policy that targets the origins of the wealth gap, the magnitude that it's developed into today, is going to bring the gap much more quickly down into sort of the range of the income gap. And that's what we find. So food for thought for the racial wealth gap and what history has told us about why we have such persistent levels of the gap and why such high levels. In the remaining time, I want to sort of maybe end on a brighter note. We can also use history to understand or to get ideas about policies that can facilitate convergence. So rather than kind of feeling like we're in a rut that we'll never get out of, sometimes when you turn back the clock, you find a moment of policy experimentation in US history that's actually quite bolder than today. And the example I'll be drawing on is minimum wage policy in the 1960s. So I'm now showing you a different form of economic inequality between Black and white Americans, which is the earnings gap between Black and white workers. Here represented as the difference in average logged annual earnings. So we can roughly interpret this as percentage differences in earnings. Now, I'm showing you here this gap from 1950 to the present. In the beginning of the period, the first couple of decades, the gap is around 50%, meaning Black workers earning about 50 cents for every white dollar. By the end of the period, the gap is more like 25%, Black workers earning 75 cents for every white dollar. What's very striking about this picture is that there was a single decade in which the gap closed by a factor of 2, the late 1960s and early 1970s. This period has been a bit of a puzzle for economists for decades. Why did it fall so quickly and so dramatically? Naturally, a lot of the explanations had to do with the civil rights era and anti-discrimination legislation, as well as dramatic improvements in relative schooling outcomes for Black children relative to white children, convergence in education. But there's something that is missing from these explanations. Improvements in education take a while to show up in labor market earnings. They won't instantly result in reductions in the earnings gap. And the precise timing of this very dramatic reduction, basically starting in 1967, doesn't really match with some of the canonical civil rights legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Voting Rights Act of 1965. My co-author and I identify an entirely different explanation for why the gap closed so quickly and so dramatically, which was expansions in federal minimum wage coverage in the late 1960s. So this image here just gives you a sense of the evolution of the federal minimum wage from its inception in the 1930s as part of the New Deal. Now, when the minimum wage was first introduced, this was an era that was, very much marked by racist public policy making. Southern legislators, fought hard to exclude Black Americans from a lot of New Deal era government programs. Now, the minimum wage is one of those. When it was first introduced, it only applied to industries like manufacturing, where it was very difficult for Black workers to get jobs due to rampant labor market discrimination. It did not apply to sectors where they were overrepresented: services, retail, agriculture. And it wasn't until the late 1960s that this was remedied. So in the blue line here, you see the level of the federal minimum wage in the industries where it was first introduced and over time in 2017 dollars. In red, you can see the introduction or the extension of minimum wage coverage to industries like restaurants, hotels, laundries. These are some of the canonical minimum wage industries of today, and they weren't covered until a full 30 years after the original law. Now, the other thing to note about the evolution of the federal minimum wage in real terms is that the late 1960s continue to be the highest minimum wage the US has ever seen. Today's minimum wage, $7.25, in 1968, in today's dollars, $10. So what we had happen here was the sudden introduction of a wage floor at essentially the highest level the federal minimum wage has ever been. Now, we do some more data sleuthing because it turns out that the 1960s are a difficult period in which to examine data on hourly wages and their evolution. And we digitize these old reports that allow us to get very detailed information on the number of workers paid in fine hourly wage bins by industry, by region, and for different groups of workers. This allows us to see the dramatic impact that this law had on the earnings of workers. I'm showing you here for workers in laundries in the US South, the distribution across different hourly wage bins on the x-axis here. So the number of workers paid each hourly wage bin in the thousands. And these different lines represent different years. For example, the dark line with hollow circles is the wage distribution in 1966, where you can see a lot of mass below $1. These are nominal dollars, so $1 in 1967. You see in 1967, after the minimum wage is introduced, a gigantic spike right at $1. These are workers being moved up to the minimum wage. So you can see this is going to be a transformational policy when it comes to wages. We're going to use this feature of the law to understand how this law impacted, and to isolate the impact of the minimum wage on earnings for workers and on earnings gaps. So what we do is we look at the gap between workers who were in the industries that were previously covered and workers that are in the newly covered industry. What you see is that the relative earnings of workers in the newly covered industries spikes right after the introduction of the minimum wage. And this continues for several decades afterwards. We then examine the impact of the law on white and Black workers separately. And what we find is that the impact on, first of all, both white and Black workers in the newly covered industries saw very large wage gains. The second thing that we find is that Black workers experienced wage gains that were twice as large as the wage gains of white workers. And that has to do with where they fall in the earnings distribution prior to the law coming in. They're concentrated at the bottom. Now, whenever you talk about the minimum wage in economics, there's always a debate about the employment effects of the reform. Disproportionate job loss for Black Americans would offset these disproportionate wage gains, for example. So we look at the impact of the law on employment, and we find a precise zero effect. This holds for different subgroups of workers, men, women, Black, white, etc. This means that these gains are real. They're not offset by job loss, and the minimum wage was able to close what we call the income gap, the gap not just between workers, but between the two groups as a whole. In fact, the minimum wage can explain about 20% of the decline in racial inequality during the civil rights era. This is massive, about as large as the effect of schooling improvements on the earnings gap. So economists might not have been aware of the role the minimum wage could play, but civil rights activists were perfectly well aware. In fact, in the 10 demands from the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, demand number 9 was for an expanded minimum wage that would cover all areas of employment. I'd like to mention here that demand number 8 was for a national minimum wage that would pay $2 an hour in 1963 dollars. That's about just over $15 an hour now. So when I say that we can turn to history to get policy ideas, I really mean it. There are lists that we can look at. All right, so my time is wrapping up, and I just want to end on the note that, the future of racial inequality is really up to us. And we make policy choices as a society that can determine the evolution of these various economic gaps. And in the interest of leaving some time for questions, I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellora, for that wonderful presentation. We will have a panel next, joined by our keynote, but we'll take a couple minutes to see if anyone wants to ask questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will be very happy to take them. And while we wait for questions, we can see if Trooper Sanders is here. Is Trooper here? Very good. Hi, Trooper again.
Hello.
And our discussant, Sarah Lenardi. Excellent. Sarah's also here. Okay, so we can just transition to the panel. So I'll introduce our discussant, Sarah Lenardi. Sarah Lenardi is a professor of economics at the University of Pittsburgh. She's also an executive committee member of this conference series, and someone whose work in economics, computer science, and social work has been deeply inspiring to many of us. And I'll hand over the mic to Sarah, who will kick us off with this panel.
Hey, thanks, Fred, for that very nice introduction. So let me just introduce our speakers. So Trooper is the CEO of Benefits Data Trust and opening up access for benefits to millions of people. And Ellora is an assistant professor of economics at Princeton, and she just spoke about a case of why we should talk about history for when we think about economic policy and the persistence of the Black-white gap. All right. So I'm going to try to ask questions that kind of, bring both of your talks together, and then, also be open to the audience for questions. So So Ellora, you talked about the need to talk about history for economic policy, and Trooper, you talked about the fact that before quantitative researchers came into this field, there was already a lot of research being done that has affected policy, it has affected conversations, right? So if we bring these two things together, some of the policies that Ellora talks about, like the 1930s, the 1960s, those were probably affected more by qualitative research that formed the conversation. And then now, as we're moving more towards quantitative research, how do you both see this affecting future policy making?
Ellora, do you want to start?
Sure, I can jump in and then hand it off to you. It's a really fascinating and excellent question to kick off with. As we were working on this question of minimum wage policy in the 1960s, we wanted to get a sense of whether policymakers at the time anticipated what the impact of the law would be, especially on racial economic disparities, and on, say, employment, et cetera. So we found an incredible statement by President Lyndon Johnson as he signed the expansions of the minimum wage into law. He said, "We know that this will uplift the most vulnerable in our society and that it won't have, disproportionate effects on job loss." And it's a kind of incredible statement. There really wasn't any empirical evidence that would stand up to our standards today at the time to support this. And so my co-author and I use this as motivation, like, well, let's test that question. It was, the debates on employment effects of the minimum wage have been raging for basically as long as the minimum wage has existed as a policy. But we've had, I would say, an empirical or a credibility revolution in economics, where we actually started using very precise research designs to ask the counterfactual, well, in the absence of this policy, what would jobs look like? Or we can really compare places that, as if randomly, get the minimum wage versus not. And those designs have really shifted the conversation, because time and time again, we saw that actually the employment effects of minimum wages were very, very minimal in much of the recent evidence.
Thank you. Trooper, just real quick, Irene is reminding me that there's live translation going on. So if we all speak slower, it would really help the translator. Thanks, Irene. Go ahead, Trooper.
So I think the Lyndon Johnson example is a great, in that there's a push-pull, I believe, with the quantitative, in that, frankly, policymakers and at the kind of political level, when you're talking about laws and sort of grand sweeps of policy, work in stories, because that moves power. And so in some cases, even if there's a vacuum of data and there's a vacuum of quantitative knowledge, that policy and political leaders will fill it in with whatever they're saying. And so it's important to be part of that debate, to bring the quantitative in. On the other side, there are, I think for some who are probably more entrepreneurial in the policy sense, I think probably on the Democratic side, there's Senator Warren. There's a late Senator Tom Coburn. When I was in government, even if I personally may not have disagreed with what he was saying, he would always find data-driven arguments around things. And even if I disagreed with it, I knew I needed to slow down and make sure I understood it, because of how he used quantitative research and analysis. And so, I think it's figuring out it. One, I think for quantitative folks, it's doing what you do best and sticking to your rigor and your credibility. But then I think it's building the relationships with others so that what you do can be incorporated into the broader efforts.
So what I'm hearing is the stories still move the policy making, but the data provides evidence that doesn't allow stories that maybe have no generalizability to push too far, right? And give some backing between the stories that are a representation of a more universal experience to gain more traction. So very nice. Okay. So here's another question. So we talked about, Ellora talks about the wealth accumulating conditions, right? And we know what one of the things that Trooper does is benefit access, right? So how far does access to benefits, making social programs easier to access, make wealth accumulation conditions more similar?
Ooh, so that's interesting. So the broad question, wow, that would be a research question I would love to dig into to be able to make the case. But here's what we do know. We know that programs such as WIC, child nutrition program targeting mothers, and SNAP or food stamps, has a significant, can have a material difference on children's development and learning outcomes. And you can sort of take from there the potential, or at least providing the foundation for broader economic mobility and achievement. You know, on the other side, if we think about broader equity questions, one study we did do was an RCT that looked at SNAP's or food stamps impact on seniors. And it showed that it could delay when a senior would go into a nursing home. So the time they can live at home. Now, if you think about the pandemic and nursing homes and care centers being an epicenter of fatalities, if you think about the enormous financial strain that having a loved one in a nursing home can place on a family, to think that investing in a better bag of groceries for seniors could have not only saved lives during the pandemic, but frankly also saved our healthcare system dollars and saved families dollars because of that could have gone to other issues to advance economic stakes is pretty significant.
Yeah, Trooper makes some excellent points there, and the example about benefits that extend life. I mean, what could be more powerful for that? That does directly translate into wealth accumulation and transmission across generations, because wealth accumulates over the life cycle. So when you think about the moment of transmitting to the next generation, the mortality gap itself between low income and high income families, between Black and white Americans, that itself can contribute to these accumulated wealth differentials. I think so. It's very clear that, you know, social safety net policies that improve economic mobility, you know, they're going to translate into faster income convergence across generations if kids can equalize in terms of their education outcomes. You know, all of those things help with convergence. But another angle to think about is the universality of these programs. So when we have programs that have, say, asset tests, you know, means tested programs, they apply extremely high marginal tax rates at the bottom and can even dissuade, you know, wealth accumulation, right? So that you don't lose access to your benefits. So the design of these policies can also have perverse effects potentially, and those are things that we want to pay attention to as well.
Okay, very, 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 very important points. So I think something from Trooper is it's the cumulative effects of shocks that benefits cushion you from, right? Like, we don't think about the fact that someone not getting their grocery for this week will then result in this humongous shock that end them in nursing home that then causes financial ruin. And then Ellora's point of like, these benefits are great and these benefits are important, but the way they're administered right now with their rigorous asset tests may discourage wealth accumulation, right? So the yeah, and I'm also thinking about minimum wage, right? Like, if the minimum wage is raised without some of this test being changed, then you could have some unintended consequences. So I think this is a good time also to answer two of the questions that is in our Q&A. I can see them kind of interacting within this minimum wage public benefits area that we're talking about. So one question is, do you think the absence of a public health system could have a similar effect to the lack of minimum wage policy in keeping the gaps in place?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. So what we know from the version of public health that we have in the United States today, which is basically Medicaid and Medicare, is that the introduction of these programs and expansions in these programs have reduced racial health disparities. So once again, I would tie that back to the mortality question and just how important the length of your life is for wealth building and for then having more to pass on to the next generation. And in addition to the end of life effects or mortality effects, there's also just productivity effects, your ability to work. Extending your working years is also a way to build wealth. So I think absolutely it'd be really great to have maybe a longer time frame view of these questions and see just how much of an effect, say, the introduction of Medicaid and Medicare, these are 1960s Great Society programs, have had on these differentials.
And it's a very interesting question. Some work we are doing right now is connecting what is the impact on health outcomes and health utilization. So the cash that we have to put towards healthcare, if we take not only Medicaid, but then bundle SNAP and other benefits as the social drivers of health, and what impact can that have? And I think when we talk about equity, there's certainly just the sheer question of health equity and how that can be addressed. But if we think about the wealth gap and economic mobility, the hard truth is that in this economy, more of us are going to need to work longer and to have the health and wellness ability to be in the labor force longer. And so, improving those health outcomes so that 60s, 70s, into 80s, you're able to still participate in the labor force. Two, I think it's looking at the intergenerational supports that are needed to advance economic mobility. And so, I frankly, one of my side hustles is I'm on the national board of Girl Scouts, and we are laser focused on how can we, yes, I am man enough to be a Girl Scout and proud of it. But one of the things that we are really interested in is girls and STEM, and girls, millions of girls to frankly be like all of you out there at this conference, and an intergenerational support, particularly in working class and families where parents may have to stretch and to do what they need to do to earn a living. Keeping the grandparents engaged and healthy can make a really big difference as a booster for economic mobility.
Wonderful points. There's another question here in the chat that is, I think for Ellora. It says, Andre Grauer asks, do we have a sense of what the impact of reducing the wealth gap would be if the minimum wage was raised today? Would it some way compare to the 1967 period?
This is a fantastic question, and I think there's kind of a two-part response. So certainly one thing that we have seen, in addition to wealth convergence stagnating, income convergence between Black and white Americans has also stagnated. And you kind of saw that in one of the figures I showed, over the past 40 years, again, the income gap has been very stable. So absolutely, we think that if we could spur or encourage income convergence to resume, and we think that, say, raising the federal minimum wage, again, it would have a disproportionate benefit for Black Americans. Both groups would, of course, see increases in wages, but because Black Americans are, again, concentrated at the lower part of the wage distribution, they're going to benefit disproportionately. So yes, this can help regenerate some income convergence. At the same time, when we look at the sources of actually a widening in the wealth gap today, a big factor is rising wealth inequality. It's the fact that you have stock equity taking off and virtually no Black Americans invested in it, while if you look at the top 10% of the wealth distribution who are seeing such huge gains, it's a virtually all white group. So what we learned is that, you can do what you can with growth of income, but if you don't address this kind of skyrocketing wealth at the top, we're still going to see a widening of the wealth gap. So we kind of need a bundle of policies that are sort of attacking things from different angles. Of course, none of those policies, can boost income growth, you can tax wealth and drive that, queue down for the most wealthy. They're still just gonna, determine whether we continue converging or keep diverging. They're not really gonna address the enormous magnitude of the wealth gap. And that's why, we really have to think about other kinds of policies. Reparations is one that kind of tries to address the starting points, is how we got to the levels we have today.
So I want to follow up on that that observation that the stocks, is what's driving a lot of the growth right now. But like there is a racial gap in using that as an asset accumulation engine. For Trooper, do you also see a similar thing in benefits? Are certain kinds of benefits being more welcome, according to racial groups than others? And if so, why do you think that is? And Ellora, like, why do you think, what is behind this distrust of stocks?
So it's a really interesting question. I mean, one, I think there's much more research that we need to do around racial and ethnic implications and angles around this. But I think we do see a few things. I think one, there can be complexity in benefits access when in communities where there may be more multi-generational households, and you just have more things to sort through, and income and assets and other things that my amazing colleagues do, but can be a deterrent for people to even like engage with this with the system and ask the questions. I think from a benefits point of view. And really seeing, the bundle of benefits that someone can have that can significantly increase their what they're able to spend as an asset, frankly. And that's a shift in our social attitudes. I mentioned earlier that we talk to people all the time who were afraid to call, who were ashamed to call, who felt it was taking something from someone else. And I don't think there is a person in the United States, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, I own a home. I take the home mortgage deduction. It is pure welfare for the better off. It is complete. It is a welfare check from the IRS. There is no one who takes the home mortgage deduction who's ashamed of it. In fact, we brag about it. And so I think part of changing the conversation around these programs is really saying, like, look, this is what you need. Sometimes you pay in, sometimes you pull out. It all kind of works out. Is an important part of using the benefit system to meet immediate needs, and it can be capital to advance equity.
Oh, that's really powerful. And yeah, I mean, shifting those kinds of norms might take a generation of, universal benefits, and then it stops feeling like a handout because it's there for everyone. On this very important question about, why might there be differences in portfolio composition and how do we address that? I just wanted to note that, when we look at portfolio composition by racial group, we do see that Black Americans hold much less stock equity than white Americans. At the same time, if we were to remove the top 10% of the wealth distribution and look at that composition again, we don't see any differentials. So really, the way to think about it is that there's a slice at the top where basically homogenous, there's not much diversity there. It's an all-white group essentially who are just making these huge gains from rising stock prices and just the appreciation we've seen there over the last 30, 40 years. So of course, there's plenty of reasons you might think that there, the Black community would not have full trust in the financial system. There's the failure of the Freedmen's Bank, right, which lost many of the savings of the newly emancipated. They put their money in the Freedmen's Bank, it gambled, it failed. And, just kind of some of the estimates are like 50% of freed person wealth was lost at that time. And you have other examples like the Tulsa race massacre, where Black wealth was just literally destroyed. And so we actually do have some evidence that this changes behavior, and some of the behavior that it changes has to do with home ownership, where people might buy homes, where you feel safe, like you won't, wake up to a firebomb or a burning cross, things like that. So yeah, as a society, we need to kind of actively address these triggers of terror and the mistrust that they then generate, that actually passes across generations as well.
Wow, this is really good conversation. between like, so what I'm hearing is there's many things, right? So Ellora is pointing out the history, and I think, like, you know, we do hear a lot about this, right? Like the kinds of past harms that that people have experienced that now reduces their willingness to adopt, you know, certain kinds of asset possibility, financial instruments. And then I think Trooper's point on like multi-generational household, just sort of like culturally how a household is composed, that's a really good point. I never thought about that, right? Like if you think about the SNAP benefit form, it has like 9 pages, and then you have to list every single family member and like what their assets are. You know, if you have 9 family members, that is 9 times harder than if you have 1, right? So like I would be like, okay, you know, it's not worth it. So that's a really good point, that like cultural household composition interacts with the access in ways we probably are not familiar with unless we are in that lived experience. So I mean, another one is like the distinction between an experience of an ethnic group versus a socioeconomic experience, like what Ellora was saying. The use of more risky financial asset is higher among the highest asset group, right? So it's like, it really doesn't matter what race you are. Like if you weren't that group, you were just not comfortable with them. So really great points. I'm gonna go back to our Q&A pan here, and then there's a question from an attendee. Are there metrics other than the wealth gap ratio of white wealth and Black wealth that you have looked at or think are important to pay attention to?
Yeah, I can start, but I think there's so many potential answers to that, of course. So, you know, one, full disclosure, when I talk about the average wealth gap, which is what I presented on, that's one type of measure. And even among wealth, we have different measures. For example, the median wealth gap, you know, that is actually larger. It's 10 to 1. So in other words, you know, ignoring the top, you might say, oh, like all of racial wealth inequality is just driven by the top. No, actually gaps are larger as you go down the income distribution, which suggests, you know, it's something more than, you know, on average, Black people have lower income and therefore they have lower wealth. In fact, you know, the median Black household does not own a home. So these are kind of some of the very striking facts we learn when we look at different measures, even of wealth. But other gaps that we might care about, you know, for example, I think a very powerful one is differences in upward mobility. So we can think about, you know, starting off from the same level of parent income, how do kids do once they grow up? And there are tremendous racial differences in this. And there's a lot of work that looks at this, some of my own work looking at the Great Migration and the backlash it generated. I found that, you know, these places like Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore that used to be part of this promised land, meaning if you could get there, if you could get your kids there, they would have a different life than they would growing up in the Jim Crow South. Well, the backlash took that ladder away. So now you see that some of the gaps in upward mobility, 2 kids coming from same levels of parent income are going to do worse because that ladder was removed. So these differentials by race, for example.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. You know, on the benefit side, I think, you know, yes, just the pure cash and what that does is important. But I think these health effects and others are important. And one thing that we are exploring now is to do some pretty ambitious work connecting benefits access and higher education, and what's the impact of benefits access can have on college student success, stability, and completion. And potentially, if you think of that as with the student, but then also the family, and some choices that students often have, or, you know, college ready folks have to make if their families are in more insecure economic conditions in terms of whether they go to school or which programs they pursue. It'd be really interesting to find out if the family is, you know, I mean, not that the benefit system is making someone completely stable, but at least more secure, where maybe the student feels comfortable going to that more competitive university across the country and frankly pursuing the kind of degrees that everyone here has that can utterly transform a family's generational economic trajectory.
Absolutely. I mean, I see that with a lot of students, right? They have they have two options, one more secure than other, but the more secure one is actually in the less good school, and they choose that one just for security. So absolutely. I think there's a follow-up question from Anna that I think is for Ellora's point on the heterogeneity in intergenerational mobility. So I think she's wondering what exactly are the heterogeneity in intergenerational mobility between different incomes level or even the variance within an income bracket.
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. So what we've found, and what other researchers have found with kind of incredible data coming from the IRS, so using American tax records, you can really get a very precise measure of the relationship between parent income and kids' adult income. And if you were to plot, on the y-axis, kids' income once they're adults, and on that x-axis, parent income, you actually see pretty much a straight line. And so what that's saying is that there's really, truly, a certain amount you get for every dollar of parent income, and that's a very linear relationship. What is another interesting statistic is the slope of that line. So when we talk about intergenerational mobility, a very steep line is saying that, basically you're born, your parents' income is going to determine where you end up. A flatter line is a more mobile society, right? So you're not necessarily locked into the bottom or the top. But this also kind of has some, perverse consequences. So for example, if you were to look at racial gaps in these two, in this line, the upward mobility line for Black Americans is flatter because you're much more likely to fall from the top than you are if you're a white American, for example. So that's kind of this sort of bittersweet, I guess, fact about when we think about upward mobility differences by race.
Okay, so we have 4 minutes, and there is one more question from the audience, and then I also want to close with another question. So maybe I'll just wrap the two together. So Lauren Chambers asked, just thank you both for such fantastic discussion, +1 for me. I'm wondering whether this discussion of Black-white disparities might be able to say, what is able to say about racial differences beyond this binary, for example, for other population, Latinx, Asians. So that's one question from Lauren, and I'm going to, just in case we run out of time, add my last question, which is I want to end at the fact that there is more movements that are moving to change the balance of power, and there's a lot of this is happening outside of academia. So what can we in academia do to be supportive or to be part of those movements? Thank you.
I can quickly just give some thoughts on those two things before passing it on to Trooper. So one, we absolutely, at least within the field of economics, need a big investment in studying these other types of gaps. There's some work, but there should be a lot more. Even the Black-white gap is something that's only recently kind of taking off in the field of economics. Of course, there's a long literature, but by a very small number of people. But what we do know, if you look at, for example, and I teach, the economic history of the US is one of land expropriation from indigenous communities. Well, that's going to translate, very clearly, right, into these wealth differences. And we see things like eminent domain used against, non-white groups, Latinx groups as well. So all of these things are going to generate wealth differences, and indeed wealth gaps between Latinx, indigenous, and white populations look very similar, very large, similar to the Black-white gap. With Asian Americans, there's a whole interesting field of study that's just trying to understand why do we pool so many different groups with such different experiences in this umbrella category. And there is a lot of heterogeneity in that experience as well as heterogeneity by whether or not your parents were born in the US or if they immigrated to the US. So there's a lot of interesting work there. And then just very quickly, I just wanted to make a statement about, clearly activism pushes policy, right? And so then we can actually learn. So it's what Trooper was saying earlier, stories move, and movements can create those narratives that move policy. And then we can kind of say, oh, well, maybe we didn't have all the data, but now we have the policy change and we can understand. So I think there's always a role you can play, maybe separate from your academic role, in terms of where you think policy should go, and that's your role as a human being engaged in society, and it's a really important one.
Absolutely, I think the the question from Black-white disparity, but how does it relate to other communities? In our work, it's something that, frankly, we have to make sure we are constantly holding our feet to the fire around, and making sure that as we are advancing equity, that we are making sure that we are being as expansive as possible and recognizing where some of our blind spots or knowledge gaps can be, because you're correct. We could have the best information on Black-white disparities or Black Latinx white disparities, and if we have not fully done our job, if we have not considered Indigenous, we have not considered Asian American Pacific Islanders. So that is absolutely correct. You know, I think in terms of the role, I think one is being your authentic selves and doing what you do really, really well. But then I think building those relationships, you know, maybe go across to the next building and head over to the sociology department and find the folks who are, you know, tearing their hair out, trying to, like, you know, write their manuscripts and build some alliances in that conversation. I'd also say that, you know, people who are more involved in the sort of outside advocacy policy world, you know, sometimes you're just kind of running on fumes with a few good talking points and a few stories, and you are desperate for some protein, some muscle. And so, like, as I mentioned earlier today, you know, Tim Neat and Joy's paper from a few years ago, why it's just been so extraordinary is that it gave people who've been arguing about some of these things some great rigor. And then two, I love the point about sometimes step outside of academia and just being engaged as a person in things, but don't underestimate even just the way you approach problems and how you think and the questions you ask and the scrutiny that you give. When it's blended with folks who may bring other perspectives and disciplines, it can be really powerful.
Thank you so
Can I
much,
just say
Ellora
one
and
other thing?
Trooper. Okay.
I'm sorry, can I just say one other thing? The one cautionary point I would say, and I mentioned in my talk earlier, that folks who are involved in data and machine learning and you're the cool kids, you know, right now. It may not feel like it sometimes when you're just doing your work, but you're the cool kids. And it can be intimidating for folks who may come from more of a qualitative background and who may have run scared from anything with a number, you know, since they were in grade school. Folks might be intimidated even having a conversation with you. And so I think part of that building that bridge is sort of figuring out how to pull people in and create a sense of comfort. And I would say that to other guilds as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ellora and Trooper. That was really, really enlightening conversation. I enjoyed it very much. I am going to, in the interest of time, turn this over to the chair of our final remarks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you, Ellora and Trooper, for that excellent discussion. I wish we had an extra hour or something to just keep it going. And especially what you said about some of these aspects of our work that we tend to ignore, the historical aspects, the psychological aspects, the logistical aspects, all that stuff really resonated with me. And also what you mentioned, I mean, the thing that I find most inspiring about this community is that many of us are researchers, but everyone I talk to here understands the importance of understanding our role in a broader context, understanding our role and responsibility as people who are not just researchers, but also you know, community members, right, and friends and neighbors to people who may be struggling and acting in that way. And so I really appreciate you ending on that very important note, and for all your wonderful work. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Irene, who's going to start us off for the closing remarks. We're at the end.
Yes, it's hard to believe that the conference is wrapping up. It's been a wonderful week. Just so many wonderful keynote discussions, this panel included, as well as wonderful presentations, social events, other opportunities to gather and meet. So we're just so grateful for everyone for being part of this conference. Okay, great. So we just wanted to start out by first thanking everyone who helped make this conference happen. So in particular, thank you to the ACM. We are an ACM sponsored conference, and so this has just been an absolute honor to be sponsored by the ACM, including the special interest groups SIG AI and SIG Econ. In addition, we'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Sloan Foundation. Do you mind going back a slide, Brad? Just our sponsors. Yes, so our sponsors, the Sloan Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, and also Cell Patterns. Thank you for your generosity. Next, we'd like to thank a big army of people who helped make this conference happen. First and foremost, we want to thank the inaugural executive committee for our conference. And so the members of that committee are the program co-chairs, as well as Kira Goldner, Max Casey, John Kleinberg, Elaine Nkondo, and Sarah Lenardi. Thank you so much to all of you. You were instrumental in guiding the conference. And this has actually been 2 years in the making. So we're so glad for all the support and work and inspiration in those 2 years. We'd also like to thank our wonderful general chairs, Elaine Nkondo and Francisco Marmolejo, who undertook this massive operation of running this first edition of this online conference with over 700 registrants. And so we're just so glad for their leadership, their coordination of our large team of organizers. So please join us in thanking Elaine and Francisco. Next slide, please. In addition, we have many people to thank. We're deeply grateful to a wonderful set of volunteers who've given very generously of their time and efforts to help pull this conference together. So we won't have time to name all of them today, but just thank you so much to our social chairs, poster chairs, geographic inclusion chairs, registration and grants chairs, accessibility chair, policy and practice chairs, proceedings chairs, social media chairs, and mentorship chairs. I want to give a special shout out to, the slides appear to have disappeared, but I want to give a special shout out to Sandra Radovanovic, who was listed under the registration and grants chairs, but actually has been secretly behind the scenes running everything administrative for this conference. So thank you so much to Sandra. Red, do we want to share the slides? Oh, I can't hear you. I think you're muted. Okay, great.
Okay, keep going.
Great. So moving on to our next slide. We also wanted to thank the many committees that helped make the virtual conference possible. So thank you so much to our partners, Andrew, who's been on all of these Zoom meetings with all of us and just giving the speakers all the technical directions. And also Sandra and Kelly and the rest of our video and virtual production team. We're also thank you to Alicia for being at Gather this whole week in case anyone had mistakes. We're also very thankful to our translators, Beatrice, Pat, and Rodolfo, who've been translating live from English to either Spanish or French. And I can't imagine how difficult that must have been because, you know, we get very excited and talk very fast. So thank you so much to all of our translators. And also a shout out to, oh yes, and Beatrice, thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. Yes, she's waving. I'm not sure if anyone else can see her, but thank you. Yay, here we go. Okay, Beatrice, you're spotlighted now if you want to quickly wave. Okay. Well, Beatrice, I think you're still probably in your channel, so we can't hear you, but thank you so much. Thank you also to many supporters for the project at various institutions, including those who ran the watch parties in multiple institutions. And so just don't have time to name everyone who we'd like to thank, but thank you to everyone who ran watch parties. Thank you to everyone who donated registration grants. And we're so thankful to everyone who participated in this conference. Great.
Oh, that's me. Okay.
Okay, I still have it. Sorry.
Oh, is it you? Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Because the spotlighting changed my whole screen.
All right, no problem.
Okay, so a few more thanks. We have so many people to thank. Thank you to our wonderful area chairs. We're very thankful for the privilege of working with this excellent group of individuals. They very closely guided the evaluation and selection of the wonderful papers that you saw presented at this conference. And so they put in a lot of time to help lead discussions, shepherd papers, to nudge them towards certain types of discussion, and were involved in many late night chats and calls. So really grateful to our area chairs as well as the program committee for all their work in reviewing and selecting the program. Okay, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Reddy.
All right, thank you, Irene. So we have a series of awards that we would like to give out for all the various wonderful contributions that we've had. And some of the presenters are here. And so as we call your name, we'll spotlight you, wave and say hi if you'd like, and we'll try to proceed in a timely way. And so we're going to try to move very quickly through all of these. We'll start with the most popular poster award. So this is an award where you, the participants of the conference, contributed significantly in the selection process. So thank you for voting, and thank you for going to listen to these poster presentations. We appreciate it. We have 2 posters that we would like to give this award to and recognize in this way. The first one is data-driven simulation of the New York foster care system. This is a poster presentation by Juho Drew, Stefania Ionscu, and Kenny Joseph. If we have any of the speakers here, let's spotlight them now, and maybe they can say, they can just wave and say hi.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for this great conference. It was amazing.
Thank you. Excellent. The second poster that is receiving this award is on designing and operating vote by mail process. This is a paper by Carmen Hasseltine, Adam Schmidt, and Laura Albert. I believe we have Carmen. Do we have Carmen?
I think Adam is there too.
And Adam is here.
A wonderful conference, and we're extremely happy to get the feedback we did on the poster. So thank everyone who came by and talked to us.
Thank you, and thank you for submitting your work. Excellent. And then next is the New Horizons Award. Irene?
Yes, so we had a set of awards for the New Horizons Award, which was intended to point toward new and innovative directions that are being explored by papers, and which we believe represent the best of this interdisciplinary multi-institutional community. And so this year we also wanted to highlight especially papers that were providing exemplary work that bridge research and practice. And so we again have 2 awardees for the New Horizons Award. The first one is Francis Ding, Morris Hart, John Miller, and Ludwig Schmidt for their paper Facing an Adult Problem, New Data Sets for Fair Machine Learning. So congratulations, Francis and John.
Thank you so much for having us at this conference. It was really wonderful. John, do you want to say anything?
Oh, yeah, just the same. Thank you so much for providing a great venue. And we had a lot of really good, interesting conversations about this. So thanks, guys.
Yes, thank you so much. Our next awardee is Alex DiCristofano, Mike Hamilton, Sarah Lenardi, and Mara McLeod on Project 412 Connect, Bridging Students and Communities. So congratulations, Alex and Sarah, I think might be here too.
Yeah, thank you so much. On behalf of both Sarah and the whole team, thank you. And this has been an inspiring conference, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. And then up next is the Best Paper with a Student Presenter Award. This was an award that highlights really excellent work that was presented by students that we were really inspired by, and we believe also exemplifies the best of this community and the best of this community to come. And so we're really honored to give out this award. So we have 2 awards under this category. The first is goes to Matan Halvi. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. This was an excellent presentation on mitigating racial biases in toxic language detection with an equity-based ensemble framework. Do we have Matan here?
Hi, yes, thank you so much for a wonderful conference and all the other presenters. I learned so much this week, so thank you.
Thank you, Matan. That was an excellent presentation and excellent work. Thank you for being part of this community. And next is a presentation by Phaedra Monaku. on dropping standardized testing for admissions trade-off information and access. Phaedra, do we have you here?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you so much for the conference. I'm really excited to receive this award, especially at the first EAAMO conference ever. Thank you again.
Thank you. And thank you for helping make this conference happen. Phaedra was our program chair for the last workshop last summer that happened virtually. So thanks for the excellent work and your contributions. And best paper, Irene.
Yes, so the moment you've all been waiting for. We're so excited to announce 2 best papers for the inaugural EAAMO conference. And so the first award goes to Nazli Sonmez, Kamalini Ramdas, and Ryan Buell for their paper, Can Shared Service Delivery Increase Customer Engagement? A Study of Shared Medical Appointments. And so we thought this was just a fabulous exemplary paper for its combination of empirical methods and very careful, nuanced a study of a way that we can increase access, but also quality of access to healthcare for many patients, especially those from more needy areas. So congratulations, and thank you so much for this wonderful submission.
Hi,
go ahead. You can say something, Nancy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this great conference, and I'm so excited to receive this award on behalf of my team. Thanks a lot for everyone.
Great. And our second winner for the Best Paper Award is, drumroll, Yusuke Narita and Kohei Yata for their paper, Algorithm as Experiment, Machine Learning, Market Design, and Policy Eligibility Rules. And so the program committee and reviewers thought this was an exemplary paper combining many of the core techniques in the EAAMO community, from empirical studies to algorithm design, and thinking about how we can use algorithms as pseudo experiments that provide us with ways to improve, for example, access to healthcare. So congratulations, Yusuke, and I see you're here if you want to say a few words.
Great, thank you so much, and it's such an honor and surprise, and I'm very grateful to all the organizers and audiences of this conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yusuke and Nazli. So we have 2 late edition awards because we wanted to just acknowledge all the different ways in which you all have been engaging with the community in addition to submitting papers. So we would like to acknowledge 4 members of the program committee who did an excellent job through the reviewing process. And the best reviewers this year are Neil Gaikwad at MIT, Emil Tamenyalov at University of Technology in Sydney, Maria Rodriguez at University of Buffalo, and Ingmar Weber at Qatar Computing Research Institute. Through the reviewing process, we really were amazed at the quality of reviews by really everyone, including these 4 really excellent members of the program committee. I have to say, I've reviewed for many more conferences than I wish to review for, and this was one of the most engaged ones that I've seen. And in particular, there was actually one discussion that Maria Rodriguez was a part of that was 40 comments long, and it really was like being in a room having a really exciting conversation with 3 researchers from many different areas. And so it was really heartening for us to see that. And so we want to thank you all. I'm not sure if we have any of the 4 best reviewers present here. Do we? I'm gonna assume no.
Not that I see. I don't.
Okay, so we'll assume no, but we'll just thank them anyway. They were really fantastic, and we really appreciate their service to the EAAMO conference.
Yes,
and
I'm so much to the reviewers. I just wanted to add that I think actually 2 of these reviewers might have been on that thread. So.
Oh yeah, there you go. It was a very, very lively conversation, and really exciting for us to see. So thank you. And really, truly, the best award, the award that we've all been waiting for, is the Best Tweet Award. So we really want to also acknowledge that. I believe we have 2 or maybe 3. So the honorary mention is Masood, our, we clearly could not give Masood this award, but really he's been doing such a fantastic job that was just cracking me up the whole week. And so we want to give an informal honorary mention to Masood. Is Masood here? Okay, I'm going to assume Masood is not here, but probably Masood is tweeting this as we speak, so it's all good. So thank you to Masood. And then for the actual Best Suite Award, we want to give this to Veronica White, who was responding to Mary Gray's threads on her fantastic keynote. So we just want to acknowledge again all the ways in which people have been engaging with this community, and it's just been really an honor for us to be feeling like we're, co-present with you all, even if virtually. And so we thank you for that. And we look forward to maybe doing this in person next year. So up next is announcements about the next conference. So as Irene mentioned, this conference was 2+ years in the making in some form, maybe even 5 years in the making, depending on how you want to count. And we were not sure what to expect, to be honest. And we were happy to have had this opportunity to have this inaugural conference with you all. But, momentum really picked up. There was really a lot of enthusiasm that we saw in submissions, in reviews, in conversations that we were having, in the emails that we got and everything. And it was really heartening for us to see. I'll also admit, a little bit daunting for us, because we thought, oh gosh, this is actually a real thing that we have to keep going. But we've been sort of simultaneously planning for the second EAAMO. So we want to make some announcements around that. The first thing that we want to announce is the program chairs for the next EAAMO 2022. And the program chairs are Elena Falsitoni from the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Dina Machuve from the Nelson Mandela Institute, African Institute of Science and Technology, Brian Wilder from Harvard and CMU, and Angela Zhao from UC Berkeley. Do we have all 4 of our next program chairs present here? If so, maybe Elena, I'll just go down in your name. If you're here, please say hi. Elena?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be in this fabulous group of chairs for the next conference, and I'm so excited to see this grow. This is a fantastic community, and anybody who's been part of this community from the very beginning knows that. And I think it's so topical. It tackles things that are around us, that are important to us, that are important to policymakers, researchers, in whatever field. It doesn't matter. It is truly a wonderful community. I'm so excited to see this grow, hopefully right here in Washington, D.C., where I am. And so I just cannot wait to see each and every one of you next year, and we'll make this wonderful. I'm so excited to be part of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elena. Do we have Dina here? Okay, I'm going to assume no. Time differences probably make this difficult for Dina to attend, but Dina is wonderful, and we're really excited to have her as part of the program chairs, and she's going to be leading the policy and practice track especially. So keep an eye out for a note from Dina over the coming months. Brian?
Brian is also not here.
Brian is also not here. Also doing fantastic work. Really excited to have Brian also join the program chairs for next year. And Angela, I know Angela's here because she's down the hall.
Hi, everyone.
There you go. Okay.
I'm really looking forward to working with the team of chairs and working with everyone. And I look forward to seeing everyone next year for another fantastic iteration of the conference.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you to all the program chairs. We're very excited for you and excited to see what's going to happen next year. We also have a submission deadline month. It's going to be in March 2022. This decision was made to accommodate for the fact that we're likely or hopefully pandemic crisis pending. We're hopefully going to have it in person, and so we want to save some time, create a buffer to allow for a shepherding process for visa applications and all the different complexities that come with having a conference physically instead of virtually. And so plan ahead. We have about 6 months plan your submissions. You saw the submissions from this year. We hope to see a lot more presentations like the ones that we saw, and a lot more innovative ones as well that we have not yet seen. And so March 2022, the date of the submission is going to be determined by the program chair. So we'll see when that will be announced, but it should be very shortly. So we're excited to announce that. And we also want to thank Sanmei Das, who has kindly agreed to be a general chair for EAAMO 2022. So he's going to be part of this broader leadership that we're going to have for making EAAMO 2022 happen. And Sanmei has been really instrumental in the formation of this conference from the very beginning. And so we're very grateful for his continued support and service to our community. Do we have Sanmei here? Okay, I'm going to assume no, but if you find him, please tell him thank you, and we'll be hearing a lot from him over the coming year. And last, we are excited to announce the location of EAAMO 2022. We're going to be having it in Washington, D.C. Again, pandemic crisis pending, but hopefully things will continue to get better, and that's a feasible option. And so if physical conferences are possible, we'll be having it in DC, where we'll be able to continue doing the kind of work that you've seen on bridging research and practice and bridging research and policy. And so please stay tuned for the specific location within DC. But if you're thinking of visiting DC sometime in late summer, early fall, this is going to be a wonderful opportunity to do that. And so we hope to see you all in person in DC in about 1 year. And I believe that is the end. Is that the end, Irene?
Yep, that's all we have.
That's all we have. Excellent. Okay, so we are going to transition into a social, an informal social on Gather. So head on over to Gather, come say hi, come say thank you to the next leadership, and also and just meet the members of this community. And thank you all for being here, for joining us, tolerating yet another Zoom call, and for all that you all have been doing. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, everyone.